Hi, so a couple things I want to talk about in the Sula pages about 89 through 134. I want to talk a little bit about the character development of Sula herself, and then also about some symbolism that begins to emerge in these pages. So we begin to get a more detailed development of Sula's character here in these pages. First, we see her as the people in the bottom, the townspeople see her, in a way that kind of emphasizes their own superstitions and their own judgment of her. On page 113, for instance, we see that they are laying broomsticks across their doors at night. They're sprinkling salt on their doorsteps because they see her as a witch. On 114, she bends over a boy who's fallen down some steps, and everyone assumes that she's pushed him, Sula that is. And they begin to see her birthmark as Hannah's ashes, the way that they mark her. On 114, Morrison writes, "It was not a stemmed rose or a snake, it was Hannah's ashes, marking her from the very beginning." They call her witch to emphasize this superstition, this kind of threatening magic they see her as possessing. And they sometimes call her roach as well. Roach as in cockroach. Cockroach, obviously not a kind name to call someone. I think here they use this name because cockroaches are really hard to kill. So she is certainly resilient. She has come back. Cockroaches keep coming back. But cockroach is also often an insult. They're kind of gross and creepy and crawl around. And on page 117, some of the ladies of the town are describing an interaction between Sula and Shadrach, and they describe the two of them as being like two devils. So the two of them similar in their position as being kind of outsiders within the town at this point. So we see Sula from the perspective of these superstitious townspeople in the bottom, those that judge her for her choices, right, for her sexual freedom. But we also begin to see kind of a more vulnerable side of her. So on page 119, we get a little bit of insight into Sula's choice to sleep with Nell's husband and some of the things that maybe have motivated her to make that choice. Morrison writes, having had no intimate knowledge of marriage, having lived in a house with women who thought all men available and selected from among them with a care only for their tastes, she, Sula, was ill prepared for the possessiveness of the one person she felt close to. Nell was the one person who had wanted nothing from her. I've just skipped down to the last paragraph on this page. Nell, who had accepted all aspects of her. Now she wanted everything, and all because of that. So here Morrison explains of Sula that she grew up in a household in which there was no sense of possessiveness over a man. So that's something that she has had to grow accustomed to. We're going to put vulnerable here. Humanized, perhaps. And maybe also a product of her upbringing. Of this kind of series of generations of women who treat men in a very different way than most people in the town do. So she's vulnerable in that way, perhaps, or humanized in that way. She also emerges as being kind of a profoundly sad character, particularly in her experiences with men. So on page 122, Morrison describes from Sula's perspective the bed, being in bed with a man, basically. It was the only place where she could find what she was looking for, misery and the ability to feel deep sorrow. She had not always been aware that it was sadness that she yearned for, but in fact, it is this sadness that she's looking for. On the next page, on 123, we get an eye of sorrow in the midst of all that hurricane rage of joy. There, in the center of that silence, was not eternity, but the death of time, and a loneliness so profound the word itself had no meaning. For loneliness assumed the absence of other people, and the solitude she found in that desperate terrain had never admitted the possibility of other people. She wept then. So in her kind of sexual exploits, she finds this loneliness in the company of others, this profound loneliness, this solitude, this sadness. And it's the sorrow that she kind of looks for in this experience for some reason, which makes her certainly a complex character. Last but not least, we see Sula in a sort of a humanized way begin to feel not necessarily love, but the sense of possession over Ajax. She begins to like Ajax, to find solace in his company, to feel possessive over him as a man, and because of this sense of possession, he leaves, and she then feels the sadness of that loss. So in this way, she becomes more similar to Nell. She has been left by a man that she likes, and that might perhaps make her more sympathetic to Nell's pain. We'll see. So the other thing I want to talk about in these pages is symbolism. Symbolism is big in all Toni Morrison, and particularly in this book. And there are a couple symbols that I want to just touch on. If we jump back first to page 89, the beginning of this chunk that we read, page 89, which is the first page of 1937, we see that Sula comes back to the bottom accompanied by what Morrison describes as, quote, a plague of robins. A plague of robins. Robins being birds. Robins are the first symbol I want to talk about. So robins traditionally or historically symbolize rebirth or new beginnings. Birds in general symbolize rebirth or new beginnings. They come back in the spring, right? They chirp in the mornings, all of these times when we are waking up or when things are growing or being reborn. So new beginnings typically are what might be symbolized by robins, which makes sense. If Sula returns to the bottom amidst this sort of swarm of birds, this is a new beginning for her, sort of a rebirth for her, a reacquaintance with the bottom and those who live there. So it makes sense that this kind of new era of Sula living in the bottom would be marked by this cloud of robins. It's interesting because Morrison chooses to use the word plague to describe the volume of robins that appear in the bottom. She calls them a plague of robins, not just a mass of robins or a large group, but she specifically uses the word plague, which has sort of negative connotations, a connotation of disease. So there's a tension here in her description. Robins mean new beginnings, but plague here is sort of an ominous word. So this perhaps might be an omen that this new beginning is not necessarily going to be a positive one or an auspicious one. And that does turn out to be the case in the choices that Sula makes in her betrayal of Nell. So robins, birds, one symbol that I want to talk about. The next one is the symbol of the red rose. Sula's birthmark is described often in these pages as looking like a single-stemmed red rose. The red rose often symbolizes desire, passion, or love. So in some ways this is fitting of Sula, right? Especially if the women in the town see her as kind of a loose woman who's sleeping with all their husbands. It would make sense that they see her birthmark as this symbol of her desire and passion. She's very sexually free. The other thing that's interesting to note about the symbol of the rose is that a rose from a distance is beautiful, but upon getting close to a rose, roses have thorns. So there's a slight sort of danger associated with the rose as well. Sometimes her birthmark is also described as looking like a snake. A snake, the classical biblical symbol, right? The snake goes back to Genesis in the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve. A snake convinces Eve to eat the fruit of knowledge. That causes Adam and Eve to be cast out of the Garden of Eden in great shame and to begin to experience the pains of mortal life. So the snake often represents kind of this wickedness, this knowledge and power, but this sort of fundamental evil. So the birthmark being described in turn as a red rose and a snake is really interesting. These are two interesting symbols for Morrison to use here to describe the birthmark. Evil, cunning. Great. Okay. The last symbol that I want to talk about is, I think, the most confusing one in the text, and that is the layers of Ajax's face and the loam, as Morrison calls it. So this we see on pages 130 through 131. Beginning on 130, I'm going to read the sections that are italicized here. Morrison writes, this is Sula who's thinking here. If I take a chamois and rub real hard on the bone, right on the ledge of your cheekbone, some of the black will disappear. It will flake away into the chamois, and underneath there will be gold leaf. I can see it shining through the black. I know it is there. And if I take a nail file, or even Eva's old paring knife, that will do, and scrape away at the gold, it will fall away, and there will be alabaster. The alabaster is what gives your face its planes, its curves. That is why your mouth smiling does not reach your eyes. Alabaster is giving it a gravity that resists a total smile. Then I can take a chisel and a small tap hammer and tap away at the alabaster. It will crack then like ice under the pick, and through the breaks I will see the loam, fertile, free of pebbles and twigs, for it is the loam that is giving you that smile. I will put my hand deep into your soil, lift it, sift it with my fingers, feel its warm surface and dewy chill below. I will water your soil, keep it rich and moist. But how much? How much water to keep the loam moist, and how much loam will I need to keep my water still? And when do the two make mud? Morrison revisits this concept of the layers and the loam on 135 as well. So this is, I think, upon first reading, a really confusing passage. Why is Sula talking about, like, scraping away at this man's face and the various layers that lie beneath? But I think that if we read these layers as symbols, this begins to make a little bit more sense. So the first layer that Morrison talks about is the gold layer. Gold is beautiful, flashy, and here right below the surface. She doesn't need much to scrape away to get at the gold. So here I think the gold layer symbolizes Ajax's beauty. He's handsome, he's beautiful and flashy, and that aspect of him and his personality is easy to access. It's easy to access for Sula. It's close to the surface, his beauty. Oh my gosh. Stop, Bob. Below the gold is what Morrison describes as alabaster. Alabaster is this plain white material. It is valuable. So below the gold, we get something a little bit more substantive, a little bit more valuable. But it's plainer, it's harder, and it's harder to access. I will write that next. So beneath the gold is something a little bit more valuable that has to be worked a little harder for, alabaster. And finally, beneath the alabaster is loam. Loam is like a dark, silty earth. It's really good for planting. It makes crops grow well. Ultimately, the loam is this soft, natural, kind of vulnerable inside of Ajax. And Sula wants to access that and sort of tend it and care for it. This is a really different Sula than the Sula who is kind of blunt and honest and sleeps with other women's husbands, right? This is a nurturing Sula, a sort of kind, maternal Sula almost. So the layers sort of signify Ajax and the way that Sula seeks to care for him, to nurture him, to access that loam deep within that she can kind of cultivate. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you, guys.